And welcome to another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. It's Ari Rosenbaum. I'm along here with Dan Venturi. Dan, say hello.
Hello.
This week's episode, we're going to talk about bad reasons for hiring 401k plan providers. And based on our experiences, we've been through a lot and heard a lot of plan providers and really the dumb reasons that they hire 401k plan providers. It just goes back to, something I really can't stand. Just people having these ideas and just making these statements that just don't really make any sense and have no relevance. I mean, it goes back to the time when I was a first year law student and I was on the mock, we had like a mock trial um, competition, moot court, it was called. And, I'm getting admonished by a second year law student because I was wearing a Flintstones tie. And I mean, I was like dumb. I mean, it had no relevance to whether my argument was good or not. So, but like that, dumb comment about Flintstones, ties. There are a lot of dumb reasons why a plan sponsor picks a 401k plan provider and why that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
I think first things first. A plan sponsor should never be excited by how the offices of the plan provider are or what the plan provider's salesperson drives. I worked at a law firm with a really snazzy office in Garden City, and to me, there was a lot of overhead. But I'm sure that there were clients that were overwhelmed by what their attorneys had. But the problem with having lavish offices, it doesn't really mean the plan provider is any good. And as a client, you're footing the bill for that overhead. When the the law firm is ordering sandwiches or whatever to feed you, you're paying for that sandwich.
Without a doubt. Likely at double the price.
Oh well, yeah. One of the weirdest things. I worked at one law firm, and if you stayed over, you stayed late, they actually charged a client for the dinner you ate, which I thought was the weirdest thing. But
Yep.
but they did it, and they actually had some really nice places for takeout. But anyway, you shouldn't be overwhelmed by it. And that goes to a concern that I had many years ago. And Rich Larita, the TPA salesperson I worked with, he used to always drive GMCs, like a GMC Jimmy or whatever it was. And one day he decided he got talked into buying a Porsche. And I told Rich that I thought that was a really bad idea. I wouldn't want to, if I was a 401k plan sponsor, I'd be a little bit upset if the TPA salesperson was driving a Porsche. Just
Yeah.
because I feel like that way I'm just paying too much in fees.
Yeah, we had not an industry story, but we had when we first moved into our home, we didn't have an egress from our basement. We only had one way in, one way out, so we put in an egress window.
Mm-hmm.
And the sales guy, shows up in a brand new Benz. That that we noticed that. I mean, we still ended up going with them because they were one of the few providers out here that actually did that kind of work, just that kind of work.
Right.
But it definitely stuck out as abnormal. We've had a bunch of folks come to the house to do different things over the years, and he was the only one that had $60,000-$70,000 automobile.
Yeah, they don't really. Again, it's not a reason why you should hire a plan provider. I mean, I work for a TPA with really bad looking offices. Thankfully, none of our clients saw it, but that's not just Again, there are a lot of reasons to hire a plan provider. You should be overwhelmed by again what their offices look like, what the salespeople drives, what the what the executives are wearing, that sort of stuff. I know it's hard to look past that, but that's not a reason to hire somebody.
No, no, and I think maybe as a segue, um, the fact that your brother-in-law or your second cousin is in the industry isn't a reason to hire them either. Nepotism is another one of those reasons that don't quite cut it in terms of positives in your evaluations of a plan sponsor.
Yeah, I just had a friend of mine email me a couple weeks back, and he said, I just I know an advisor, and he got replaced by somebody's brother, executive's brother, who is going to be on the plan getting paid some VIPs, but is actually not a 401k plan advisor. He has to partner up with somebody that actually does. And I said, unfortunately, that is not like a per se prohibited transaction because your brother isn't like your wife or your child in terms of prohibited transactions. But if you can't find a good enough reason that you hired him, and I think that if you hired somebody to get paid on a plan and they don't know how to actually service it, that could be an issue. And you should never, nepotism with a family-run business. Listen, it's the name of the game. When my father's partner brought in his son and daughter who really weren't bright, and brought them in. Listen, that's a family-run business for you. Nepotism is part of the game. But as a plan fiduciary, you can't really do that and use that because a plan fiduciary, you have a duty of care with respect to the participant's money. And, just giving somebody a relative a job and that's the reason you hired them is just a poor reason and should be avoided.
We had a client of ours who, this is sort of an interesting story, and it's the only time it's ever happened. Client left, but they were a client that I had gotten from or through the brokerage firm I used to work for, used to consult for, and so they had their health and welfare with that firm. New CEO comes in, decides he wants to give all the business to his wife, sends all of us pink slips, right? We're all fired. Well, the CEO, I guess he thought he'd have more autonomy, but he gets a phone call from private equity ownership that says, we heard you fired all of our service providers. You have 2 weeks to explain to us why, or else you're out on the street. Suffice it to say, we got the client back on all three lines, right? So retirement, health and welfare, and property and casualty. I venture to say that particular executive will never make that mistake again.
But, it's happened where I've heard, the boss, whatever, hired his wife as the broker. And, again, as a plan fiduciary, you can't make any deals or cut any deals with plan providers that is going to benefit you in some to some extent. And obviously, if your wife's a broker, you're going to indirectly do well with that. You're going to benefit from that transaction. And again, as a plan fiduciary, you have the highest duty of care and law and equity. You can't go around doling out jobs to your friends, and that's really. That's really it. It's not a reason to hire a plan provider. You hire plan providers who are going to do a good job, not because of what they can do for the plan and not what they can do for you personally. Another dumb reason is I hired the provider because they have a lot of years of experience. Listen, I have 20 years of experience, but when I had 5 years of experience, I was a pretty good ERISA attorney. Don't be overwhelmed by plan sponsors should be overwhelmed by plan providers just because they've been 20, 30 years in the business. I have a client who was burned by an actuary who was 30 years in the business. There are a lot of good providers out there that may be a little wet behind the ears, but years of experience doesn't necessarily mean years of competence, because I know a whole ton of plan administrators, 15, 20 years in the business, that know less than somebody who just graduated college. That's not, again, that's not a measurement. Goes back to the movie Caddyshack. Judge Smails asks Ty, it's played by Chevy Chase, how do you measure yourself against other golfers? You don't keep score. And Ty says, by height. And you can't measure plan providers by years of experience. That's just, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah, they're not somebody right off the street, right out of college. But again, I'll tell you that it's not a synonym for competence. Experience doesn't necessarily equal competence. So don't disqualify a TPA or a financial advisor just because they don't have decades and decades of experience. And a question of years of experience. How good was that experience? If you had 25 years in the business and you're constantly getting fired by every client, it doesn't mean anything. So that's something really, really a plan sponsor should avoid.
It means you probably should have rethought your career 10, 15 years ago.
Exactly. Another dumb reason is they do something else. And we see that with the the payroll providers who do TPA services. So plan sponsor will hire their payroll providers TPA just because they do payroll. Or they hire a financial advisor just because they're an offshoot of the third-party administrator. There's not necessarily wrong things about that, but that's not just the reason to hire a plan provider. If there was a payroll provider TPA that did good work, and outside of the, I can't speak outside of the other two big payroll provider TPAs out there. There may be somebody very, very good. I don't know who they are. But that is, in of itself, not the only reason you should hire a plan provider. Just because they happen to do something else. Like a bank who's in the TPA business, you like your bank. You want to keep all your business one place. That's not a good enough reason to keep them as a TPA. It's just really, you need, plan sponsor really needs a rational process in order to hire plan providers. And just because they do something else, just really isn't the reason to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Another dumb reason or bad reason to hire a plan provider, they have a lot of acronyms behind their name, and the plan sponsor really has no idea what those acronyms mean. When I went to BU, Boston University, for my tax law LLM, and I passed 3 state bars, I don't have any other acronym. But in the retirement plan business, they love acronyms. There's CFP, CLU, QQA, QKA, QPA, CBS, CHFC, CPC, and what seems like any other combination of 3 letters. To me, it's like almost like sorority or fraternity of the Greek alphabet.
I think if you put a couple of different ones together, you might come up with a new atom for plastics.
Exactly. And you know what? And it's not a knock against, ASPA, or it's not a knock against some of the insurance tests out there, or, a lot of the good, good companies out there, FI360 and this and that. It's not a knock against them. It's just that that's not good enough reason to hire a plan provider just because they have a whole bunch of acronyms, especially when the plan sponsor has no idea what that is. And just having an acronym doesn't mean that they actually sufficiently hold the requirements to have that acronym. So I once worked for a TPA, and the COO of the TPA claimed that he was a certified employee benefit specialist, except he didn't keep up to date with his CLE requirements, CE requirements with ASPA. And, I also know of a financial advisor out here in Long Island that I think literally created his own acronym.
Really?
Yeah, I don't want to say what it is because I think you'll find out who that is. But there's an advisor out here who, there's a number in the acronym. That's all I can say.
Nice.
And I think he literally created the specialty. And I don't work with the advisor anymore, but even when I did, I thought it was the funniest thing. And he holds himself out to be this, number type of advisor, but it's self-certified. It's like when some guy makes himself a minister by creating his own church. It's kind of that thing.
Hey, Ari, we should launch that 401k
institute
credential.
Yeah, we'll just have a printing press. Remember the old? Did you ever? I don't know how old you were in school, but I always remember the old Rexo machines. That you just churn out you just run a stencil, and it just runs copies. That's how I think we should churn out our accreditations. We should go into business.
Yeah, was that the machine they used to use for credit cards?
No, that was you're talking about the switch where they actually had the carbon.
Yep.
No, I'm talking about in school when the teacher would do a handout, and she would do it on the blue Rexograph. It's a stencil, and then you run the stencil over the machine and prints out copies. It's like before Xeroxes were popular and cheap for a school to have. So it was I think it was a Rexograph or mimeograph machine. But anyway, you just
I just don't remember it.
I do, because I used to remember at school, and people like to smell the stencils. I don't know if it made them high or anything, but people love the smell of the ink stencils. But yeah, I think maybe we should do that that 401k institute.
Absolutely, absolutely. Coming to a city near you.
That reminds me, there was a 30 for 30. There was a book about it, but there was a small 30 for 30. I think like video about these autograph forgers, and the guy would forge like the perfect Mickey Mantle signature, and so he went to business with people, and they actually hired somebody to do certification. And he had no background in certifications. He couldn't tell you a real signature from a fake one, but they hired him because his name was DiMaggio. And so they made it out to be that he was like Joe DiMaggio's relative. He had no experience whatsoever in picking out what was authentic and not. And so he would churn out these certificates of authenticity that were completely worthless.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so as a planned sponsor, great the guy's got acronyms or the gal's got acronyms, but it doesn't really mean anything if you don't know what it means and you don't know the accreditation process, or, it's just a made up term, or, the person didn't even have up to date credentials. So don't be overwhelmed for that.
Sure.
And of course, we talked about, don't pick somebody just because they're related to you in business and life. And, we talked about the life aspects. Don't hire somebody just because they're a relative. Don't hire your bank as a TPA just because you want to keep a credit line over there at the bank. Plan sponsors really can't do anything and make any decisions in hiring a plan provider just because it benefits them. It has to be what's good for the plan.
Well, yeah, and we've lost plans in a prior life to banks because, I mean, we've had CFOs tell us this, they were getting preferential rates, right? Like there was a benefit gain by combining the products, which is a no-no as well, right? You can't pick a provider because you're getting a better interest rate on a loan. Those are independent products, right?
Right.
So the other one too that I don't know if we've talked about is geography. We get the opposite or the inverse a lot, where we want a local guy. Don't hire them just because you want somebody local. There are a ton of really great providers, really great advisors that aren't right down the street from you, right? If you live in a rural part of the world, or a part of the world where there isn't, in the Northeast, advisors are a dime a dozen. But if you've got a plan in Winslow, Arizona, for example, the old Eagles song, which is a real place. My friend actually was there over the summer.
Yeah, there's a statue over there in honor of the song.
Yeah. Don't hire the only TPA in Winslow, Arizona, because you were also in Winslow, Arizona, right? Like, do a little bit more research, maybe. Consider someone in Colorado or Utah or New Mexico or whatever other states, border Winslow, Arizona. So yeah, geography, I guess, was one I'd add.
Yeah, I mean, in this day and age, back in the 90s when, the internet wasn't so prevalent and you needed to see somebody more locally, it made sense. But in this day and age, you can have your TPA in New York, and you're in California, and then there's nothing wrong with it.
No.
So, this completely, again, I just don't see anything bad behind it. And last but not least, they're the cheapest plan provider. I think that I think there's really a misconception that plan sponsors have, thanks to fee disclosure. Fee disclosure really made fees a big focal point, and that's good, except when the plan provider is chosen just because they happen to be the cheapest. That race to zero that all these plan providers were worried about really didn't happen. But again, it's pause for concern when a plan sponsor picks a plan provider just because they're the cheapest.
Yeah, no, in fact, I'd be leery of the cheapest. I don't know who it was. Running in somebody, I was in a restaurant once, and they had one of those plaques, Yeah, remember those inspirational posters, plaques that you see?
Yeah, we used to work. We when I worked at a TPA, we they used to be like these stores. I forgot what they were called, whatever. But they were like these really like uplifting posters, and I always thought
Yeah,
that they were a joke. And
exactly.
we actually worked with an administrator once who had these signs, and I'm like, my God, that's the idiot who actually put that stuff.
Well, so there was a restaurant, and it was smartly placed, right? It was a sign close to the cash register, and it was the concept was be leery of paying too little, right? And to your point, cheapest isn't best. You have to understand what you're getting for that number, right? No one does this for free. Um, we're looking at TVs, and we brought a price match to Best Buy, and they wouldn't price match it because the vendor was, unsubstantiated. Be leery of paying too little. What are you going to get for that number? There's a reason why it's $2,000-3,000 less than the marketplace. It's not because they like you, right? It's not because they're giving you a deal. There's probably some serious deficiencies in the product they're offering you. So just be careful of paying too little.
Yeah, I mean exactly. And again, the cheapest isn't necessarily the best. And I've seen too many plan sponsors who pay the hard way, pay through the nose, because they pick somebody who was the cheapest, and not only were they cheap, they were also deficient, and they're cheap in the service. So they always have that expression: "You get what you pay for," and I think that
Yep.
that's really holds true, especially when you're hiring the TPA. Too many TPAs make really bad mistakes. The cheapest make a lot of mistakes. Doesn't mean all cheap providers are bad. It just means that just picking them for being the cheapest is a bad reason. There are
Mm-hmm.
some good low cost providers, but I've seen a lot of plan sponsors pay the hard way because they picked a provider that was the cheapest, and that was the only reason they hired him. So I think that'll be it for this week's episode.
Hey, we didn't plug Tampa.
Oh yes, let's plug our events. Tampa in March the 7th and 8th. The Vet 401k conference, March the 7th. Tropicana Field, March the 8th. Again, that's a plan sponsor event. That 401k plan sponsor forum on March the 8th. Wade Boggs is our guest for both days. April the 12th, we'll be in Atlanta. May the 3rd, we will be in Kansas City. June the 14th, we will be in Denver, Colorado. October 11th, we will be in Foxborough, Massachusetts. And that's it for now. We'll announce the guest hopefully soon for Atlanta. I don't know who I'm hoping for, either probably Dale Murphy or Tom Glavine. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Those are great guests.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what Larry does for us. So until next week, beyond adieu or something, or as I say from where I'm from, shalom and Lahit Road. So
Arrivederci.
take bye.